Yes. All right. For those of you who are going to be used to my normal, usual, incredibly efficient walk through these meetings, I've been provided with a list, which I'm going to consider really an objection by staff to my usual, normal course of dealing. There are several items that are going to be apparently discussed in detail. Cynthia, please have your 3-minute button handy for all of the staff members.
Ready.
So just for those people who are interested, items on the new business, items number 1, 3, 5, and 7, apparently we're doing odds and evens, are going to be discussed. And on the staff reports, I guess by lottery, it's going to be Cynthia and Marcella who are going to be discussing member services and benefits administration in more detail. I am hoping and praying that the rest of the meeting will go as efficiently as they normally do. All right, so let's start with new business. First item, staff's recommendation to deny Leonard Wilson's appeal. I understand, Susan, you're going to be addressing that, and we have, is it Mr. Wilson? All right, Mr. Wilson. Thank you for being here. Susan, fire away.
Thank you, and good morning. Staff is recommending that you deny the member's appeal. The member, Leonard Wilson, is essentially appealing his domestic relations order. Staff has been adhering and administering his benefit pursuant to the court order, and the appropriate place for Mr. Wilson, if he is disputing his order, is to get an amended order with the court.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions of Susan, or should we wait and pose questions at the end? All right, hearing none. Mr. Wilson, I think you have 3 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Leonard Wilson, and this month I became a 32-year SDCERS member. I am asking for your discretionary authority to give direction to SDCERS and approve the drop calculations prepared on September 11th, 2017. My justification for this request is as follows. The SDCERS staff report before you incorrectly states that I met with SDCERS on September 23rd, 2017. I met with SDCERS on September 11th, 2017. The drop election executed between SDCERS and me stated that it is irrevocable 7 days after signing, and my member status will change to an active drop member. My drop entry became irrevocable on September 18th, 2017. SDCERS restates this to me in their letter dated June 8th, 2018. The staff report also incorrectly states that I could not enter drop because I did not have a DRO. This is false. On October 4th, 2017, SDCERS acknowledged that I was in drop. This document was omitted from your staff report, but it was included with my appeal letter to you dated July 2nd, 2018. On March 13th, I met with SDCERS's legal department and discussed what was needed to activate my drop account. During this meeting, SDCERS stated that I needed to select retirement option 4 with specific beneficiary selections. I agreed to these terms. I also discussed my drop percentage of 73.85% and presented a copy of my executed drop paperwork. I specifically asked if this percentage would remain. I received no verbal response, but I was told that I would receive a written response addressing all the items discussed. On March 14th, 2018, I received a written response. During this March 15th, 2018 meeting with SDCERS, I noticed my retirement percentage was lowered. When I asked why, I was told that nothing was communicated from SDCERS's legal department to SDCERS's retirement counselors. Since the retirement counselor had no knowledge of the change, I went ahead and re-signed the drop paperwork. I wanted to keep my agreement reached with SDCERS's legal department, and since the written response made no mention that my 73.85% would be lowered, I acted in good faith and re-signed the drop paperwork. Lastly, I don't understand why SDCERS cannot tell me the dollar amount of my portion of my drop account where if I were to complete 5 years in drop. This concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to discuss any item and answer any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, thank you very much, and more importantly, thank you for staying to the time limit. I do have a quick question for you. Do you have any legal authority for why the SDCERS board can essentially ignore a domestic relations order issued by a judge?
What I'm contesting is I was told I was in drop way before the DRO was even submitted, and I had a percentage, and that percentage was changed. Now, if there was an error, I can understand that, but I was never told there was an error, especially after I met with SDCERS Legal, and they said, and I specifically mentioned the 73.85%, and they said nothing, but they said, we will respond to all the items we talked about in this meeting in a written response. And I said, great. Well, when I received the written response, there was that one little portion that mentioned that they would tell you what was going to be done. Well, when I met with the counselor said, I know nothing. And I said, okay, then therefore the 73.85% seems appropriate.
So just so I understand, you're not objecting to the court order, the domestic relations order?
No,
Okay,
not at all.
so if the benefit is calculated consistent with the court order, then you're in agreement with that, correct?
No, I'm saying.
Okay, wait, because this is what I need to understand. It seems to me it's inconsistent. I think there's two issues here. One is, do you have the right benefit? And one is whether you're happy or dissatisfied with the way staff handled your request or your paperwork. Those are two different issues. Both can be addressed, but they're two different issues. What I'm trying to understand is the first one. You don't have any objection to the DRO, the domestic relations order paperwork. You don't think that the order was wrong. And the question I'm going to ask you again, just so I understand your position, is that if SDCERS calculates your benefit consistent with the court order, since you're in agreement with the court order, then you must then therefore be in agreement with SDCERS calculation, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
but
okay, I appreciate that. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that logical piece. The second issue I want to just address briefly, because I want to make sure I've understood you, is that you are unhappy with the information that was relayed to you in your meetings and interactions with SDCERS. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I want to deal, if I'm not mistaken, I think the issue that we're dealing with right now is as to the first, and I want to deal with the second part of that next. Okay, so I'd like to keep our comments, I want to keep these two issues separate. So on the first issue, does anybody have any questions for Mr. Wilson or of Susan from the committee? Val.
Mr. Wilson, staff's position is that paragraph 6 of the domestic relations order describes how the community property share of your benefit is to be calculated. Do we agree on that? Is that right?
Correct.
All right. Staff says that the result of performing that calculation is that your share of the benefit is 64.81%. Do you believe the calculation to be correct, or do you believe the calculation's erroneous?
The calculations are incorrect. The 73.85 is what I was told was the correct calculation.
Staff's position is that the 73.85% was a prior estimate that was provided to you, but that when the calculation was performed pursuant to paragraph 6, it came out to be 64.81%. Do you understand that?
I accept that, and I thought when I met with the retirement counselor the second time, I thought I would be told and walked through the calculations as specified in the letter to me of the meeting 2 days prior. So it was a current event. Everything was fresh in everybody's mind. I expected to hear from the retirement counselor, here's the revised calculations. The retirement counselor said nobody, not one person from SDCERS Legal spoke with him. However, SDCERS Legal knew I was meeting with them because they set up the meeting. Therefore, I went in thinking I would be told something, and I was told that nothing was communicated.
So have you ever been provided with the calculation that shows why it's 64.81% and not 73.85%?
I've never been provided that, same as I've never been given what my drop percentage is.
If you were provided with the calculation showing why it's 64.81% instead of 73.85%, and you agreed with the calculation, would you continue to believe that SDCERS should should still pay you the 73.85 because that was the earlier estimate?
Correct.
And what's the basis for that? That it became final on 9/18/17?
That and that the real turning point here was when I met with SDCERS Legal and I showed them the 73.85 calculations. They acknowledged that percentage and they said, we will give you a written response. I received a written response, and the written response says that can I go back to that slide, please?
Yeah.
Can you put the PowerPoint on, please?
They're hard to read on the screen because it's kind of fuzzy, so I'm.
Yeah, it's
I have to look
slide
at the
number
big screen to
5.
see it.
And it's in your packet. It is,
Attachment.
it is page 46. No. Okay, yeah, what I have there highlighted is to discuss your revised retirement allowance. Okay, nothing said anything about the percentage, but I had to assume that that's what I would be discussing. The retirement counselor had no information. In fact, he was as surprised as I that there was something changed.
Okay. So then let me ask Ms. Youngflesh a couple of things. Was the 73.85% estimate that was provided to Mr. Wilson ever identified as an entitlement versus an estimate?
My understanding is it was purely an estimate.
And the 64.81%, has Mr. Wilson been provided with the calculation for how SDCERS arrived at that number so that he can have it reviewed by an expert or review it himself and verify that it's correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is that something we could do?
I believe so. Yes.
And then my next question is, Mr. Wilson's emphasizing here that he had a meeting on September 11th of 17 instead of September 23rd of 17, and he believes that makes a difference because of some finality that occurred 7 days later. Do you know what that issue is? Do you understand that issue?
I believe he's speaking about changing his drop beneficiaries, possibly.
Let me ask
Or is
Mr.
it-
Wilson, would you clarify what you mean by that?
In my July 2nd letter to SDCERS, I specified that if my percentage was going to be changed, that completely changes my financial planning. And if that would be the case, then I would maybe look at the option of stepping out of drop for some period of time. The response I received back was saying that that is not allowed because 7 days after you signed the drop paperwork on September 11th, which made it September 18th, it was irrevocable. Therefore, that option came off the table.
But that option was off the table whether you met on September 11th or whether you signed it on September 11th or September 23rd, it doesn't matter. It was off
Doesn't
the
matter,
table.
correct. And when,
So what your position is that if you had known it was going to be 64.81%, let's call it 65, instead of 74%, you would have made a different decision?
definitely, I would have probably waited a year or 2 or 3.
And what impact would that have had?
Well, it's a difference of a minimum. Yeah. Again, SDCERS hasn't given me any calculations, so I struggle trying to pencil out dollar amounts, but I know it's a significant amount, so I would have waited.
You would have earned
More money.
a higher percentage because of years of service.
Correct.
Your years of service as a single person would have been greater as compared to your years of service as a married person?
Well, no, correct,
Or
but
just your benefit would have gone up?
both.
Okay. Let me ask Ms. Youngflesh to just address those points.
So I think that the point that's getting confused is he retroactively entered drop on September 23rd. He could not enter drop in that we can't process his benefit without the court order telling us how to do so. And so we didn't get that until February 2018. He re-signed the paperwork in March 2018, And we honored his request to retroactively enter drop on September 23rd.
And at the time that he reaffirmed that he wanted to enter drop as of the prior date, did he understand that the SDCERS was calculating the benefit at 64.81%?
I was not personally at that meeting. However, he did have the domestic relations order, which outlines how it will be calculated. So I can't attest to his actual understanding of that.
Perot doesn't tell him what the percentage is. That's something that we at SDCERS would have to calculate, right? Is that right?
Correct.
And do you know whether that calculation had been done and communicated to him? Is there any evidence on that?
I believe Marcel was.
Hi, Marcel.
Good morning. There is a email to Mr. Wilson from Catherine Reinholtz, who is one of our paralegals, that tells him the percentage is based upon a numerator of 23.922512 while married and a denominator of 31.040290 years of total service. The service fraction, that service fraction is a community property. Half of it belongs to his former spouse. So that is her 38.53%, which gets to his percentage. So, but that was on March 27th, that was emailed to him. But the bigger issue is when a member comes in and is meeting with a counselor, we are very clear that that is an estimate. It is an estimate based on when you plan to enter, drop, or retire and what your service credit is as of that time. It's also an estimate based on what your final average salary is at that time. And in this case, because we did not have the domestic relations order until February, it's a courtesy that we do offer to our members. We will honor your original drop date, even though we are waiting to get the domestic relations order. But until we get that domestic relations order and until we have final pay period information, we aren't able to calculate a benefit.
So here's where I'm going with this. I don't think that we have any discretion, contrary to what Mr. Wilson may believe. I don't think we as a board have any discretion to do anything contrary to the domestic relations order. It binds us just like it binds him and everybody else. Only a judge can change that, not this board. However, I'm hearing a little bit different claim here, which is that when I made my decision, I wasn't provided with the right information, and had I had the right information, I might have made a different decision. So does this board have discretion to say, okay, we will allow you to undo your drop election and redo it at a later date, or do something to adjust it in light of the fact that if we were to conclude that his position's reasonable, that a person in his position would have waited had he known it was only 63.81% or 64.81%, not 73.85%, if we say, well, that would have made sense for him, why did he do this? Doesn't make sense. Then I could see saying, okay, well, then we need to look at whether he was given adequate information to make his decision. And that's a different question entirely, I think.
I believe that is a different question. And what I would ask for input from the board on is, we have traditionally, this is something we struggle with quite a bit. This is not, unfortunately, an unusual situation where a member comes in and wants to either service retire or enter drop, and they do not have an executed DRO yet. And so our position has been that we will accommodate those members and let them pick their date, even though we don't have the information. And we're not able to provide them with a more accurate estimate until we have that information. So I understand the difficulty that we have there. If it's the board's recommendation that we do not do that to avoid these problems, then that's something that we need to look at internally so that we say, okay, you can enter drop or service retire once we have that domestic relations order. Because in this case, my understanding is the original estimate was done with an entirely different retirement date. So when you cut a bunch of time off the retirement date, that has a significant impact. There are a lot of different factors. And the ability for us to estimate a retirement benefit, whether it's drop entry or service retirement, when we're doing a DRO option 4, that is a very complex calculation. And even if a member were to come into us today and say, I want to know what it looks like if I do a DRO option 4 in a year and a half, that is going to be an estimate, and it's going to be with a lot of caveats. It is extremely difficult to calculate that. It depends on who's paying for the reduction, what they do between now and then. The member could go out on disability, they could go out on LTD, they could get a huge raise, they could retire earlier. There's so many caveats to that. So that's the struggle we have.
I understand. And Marcel, just for the record, I'm in favor of making as many accommodations to our members as we can make. I'm not interested in dialing back on accommodations to members. All that I'm concerned about here is whether in this specific case, the information that the member had was incomplete. We had better information. The member didn't get the information and relied on a misunderstanding. That's all I'm really looking at.
We didn't have better information. At the time that we gave Mr. Wilson the information, that was the best information we had. We had better information in March. So then there is the issue of...
talking about March.
Yeah, so now in March, he has better information, and if that makes a difference, then I would defer to legal on whether the board can
It may be
change
a
the
matter
start
of a
date.
couple of days. I just don't know, between March 23rd and March 27th, should we have been providing him with the revised percentage? I don't know.
Okay, I want to just take control of my own meeting back again for a second here, if you don't mind. This is a great discussion, but it's not on the agenda. What's on the agenda is the calculation of the benefit. And so that's why when I started off this issue, I think we need to break this into two parts. We need to deal with this issue, and then I think you make a very good point, which is, do we need to then come back, look at the specific issues for the question that you're asking about, Val, which is, hey, was there an issue that happened here that requires us to do something to accommodate this member? And I think we can deal with those totally separately. So if there's not an objection from me, I really would like to take a vote on this issue. I'm happy to entertain a motion from anybody on this board who wants to look into this further, allow Mr. Wilson to come back with a different request or with a request over that issue. But the way this is framed here, when I read this paperwork, it is all dealing with the calculation of the community property, recognizing his interest in the community, all the things that we can't do. So unless there's an objection to that, go ahead, Tom.
I just have two questions. One could we table the matter, and then the other one would be between September of 17 and March of 18. Was he still making contributions, or was all of that stopped? Was he still? Because that was a limbo period between when he got the DRO and when he was retroactively. Was he actually still making contributions for that 5-6 month period?
I believe he was still making contributions during that time period. His service credit increased as well.
And you had a second question?
Can we table the matter at this point
So
that more
okay,
information
so
can be
I
made
want to
and
be
bring it back to the next
okay.
meeting?
So my preference is that we don't table the matter because what's before us, we can't grant that relief.
I believe we
But-
can, and I believe it's member appeal number 4.
Would-
In his appeal, not in staff's report, he specifically talks
his appeal.
about...
Okay.
Yeah, about the fact that he
Let me go back. Go ahead.
was unable to make a sound retirement decision, lacking data and information. I believe that encompasses the issue I'm talking about, and I'd like more information about it. And presently, I'm not prepared to vote in favor of staff's recommendation.
So wait, let me hang on one second. Are you and I looking at the same?
I'm reading on page 14 of his submittal. Here.
Right here.
And Val, if I may, on page 14, that was the appeal he made to Cynthia Queen. The appeal he made to the board is on page 2 and 3, Bates stamp number 2 and 3.
So there's a different.
I would treat this appeal as including all the things that he's appealed to staff and up to the board. I mean, how can we hold him to a standard of he has to exactly explain what his issue is every time? I'm going to vote against staff's recommendation.
Okay, so, I mean, my frustration, I think it needs to get addressed. I do, but I don't
think it needs to be addressed before we make a final decision on the appeal. I think we should get all of it together, look at it, and maybe the remedy here isn't what he... I can't imagine the remedy here is that we're going to go against a DRO. We're not. But there may be another remedy here, and I don't want to close this appeal and foreclose remedies without addressing that, because there are time constraints on filing appeals, there's costs involved in filing appeals. I'd like to get it all dealt with.
So let me ask this question, Johnny. The question I have is there, and I understand Val's issue. He doesn't want to shut Mr. Wilson out if there's another remedy. I would like to just dispose of those things that are easy issues. So my question is, can we resolve the issue on the calculation in the DRO and still keep open the issues dealing with staff looking into what information was provided, what happened with his decision, what remedies may exist, and bringing that issue back?
I believe you can.
Okay, so that's, I mean, because that's really what I'd like to do. I'd like to get rid of the issues that are really a non-issue and keep open for
What if
staff.
All right, so what if we were to decide in December or January that, that in fact the member is correct, that, that we had information about the calculation, that he lacked that information, that he made a decision without adequate information, and that he would have made a different decision?
And I'm fine with keeping all those issues open.
Okay, but then how does that impact the DRO and everything going forward? If we come back and say, you know what, he's right, we have to make an adjustment and allow him a later, we have to make a financial adjustment here and reconfigure this so his drop is later.
But it doesn't affect I mean, we can't change the spousal benefits, so what different?
But that might change the percentage.
If he exits drop and re-enters at a later time, that will change, it will
Right.
change everything. It will change his benefit, it'll change the percentage.
It'll change both. And
Right,
so
which
then,
is-
then it's no longer 64.81%. And so now, or 63.81%, whichever it was. And so now we've been acting as though it were, when in fact we need to recalculate it.
Okay, but I mean, isn't that going to be the recommendation anyway, to recalculate it if we let him change the drop issues?
If the board decides to allow him to enter drop at a later time, we would recalculate the benefit at that later time. That's not a problem.
Right,
So in
then
the
why don't we
meantime,
bring
are
this
we
back?
making payments under the DRO?
No, because he's in drop. Oh, I understand your question now. No, there are no payments to, during your time that you are active drop, there's no money leaving the system. We just know how much to withhold, and it's being held. But just as we cannot pay anything to the member during drop, we cannot pay anything to the former spouse.
So we would have to just, if we recalculated it, we may have to say to him, you owe us more money, and then ultimately your drop benefit's greater or
We
something.
would just adjust the drop account. Whatever the new calculation is, we would correct it in the drop account. So at this point, because monies have not gone out the door, it is possible mechanically for us to unwind and redo.
If we were to approve staff's recommendation to deny this appeal, what would we be accomplishing today? If we're going to go back and revisit that issue?
Well, we've resolved the issue of the DRO.
What issue?
Well, the issue is that that the system has, that we're not going to override the DRO, number one. We're not going to change those issues.
No,
and
but
we're
we
not-
may change our calculation, in which case everything changes. So what are we accomplishing by approving a denial of the appeal? What have we done? I would rather
Okay.
have it come back.
Is there, if that's what everybody wants to do, I have no problem bringing this back at, I guess it would be the next
Well,
committee
I
meeting.
would ask Marcel or Johnny or Susan, by denying the appeal today, what benefit does that have to anybody? Well, how does that move the ball forward?
I would just ask the committee and then the board to clarify exactly what you are denying. If you're denying that we will honor 71.85% because it was on an estimate, then that would be clear. But of course, that would leave open what percentage is the proper division.
Right. And so I don't see, of course, we aren't going based on an estimate, and we're not going to go based on an estimate, but I don't see why having a vote on that today does anything, and I think it just creates murkiness. I would rather have the appeal come back with answers to the question of what did we know, when did we know it, what did we communicate to the member, and when did we communicate it, and then evaluate whether we've got it right.
And I'm fine with that. Is that the consensus of the committee?
I believe you have all of that information, Val. The question is, because there was a gap from when Mr. Wilson wanted to enter drop in September to when we received the DRO and redid the calculations. I think the question is, because of that gap and now a different percentage, is the board going to allow him to change his drop date? But as far as what was communicated when, we have clearly that in March it was communicated what the new percentage was to him. Communicating that to him in March with a September drop entry date does not allow him, under our current rules, to change his drop entry date. So that is a risk when someone has that delay. But according to what I can see in the documents, the information was communicated. It just, what was unexpected was the difference.
So when
in
he
the
reaffirmed
estimate.
his decision in March, he knew his percentage was the 64 and not the 73.
I don't know if he knew it at the time he signed the new document, but within a couple days, he got the email from Catherine Reinholtz with, here is the new percentage. Either way, though, the drop entry, according to our board rules, is irrevocable when you sign the document. So he signed that document back in September of 17, saying he was going to enter drop. We don't, so that's,
The info.
pardon?
But he didn't have the info.
Right, and that unfortunately is not completely uncommon. We do have members that do that.
No, my position is I did have the info. That was the 73.85%.
But I don't think I don't think you've got any support for that, because that was an estimate. The real info is 64.81. And so my question is, if you'd known that in March, when we all knew it, when staff knew it, could that have made any difference for you?
Well, yes, but there's one thing that I need to make clear is that on October 4th of 2017, I was told by SDCERS I was in drop. And I even sent an email back saying, great, thank you. Well, a few pay periods went by and no drop money was coming out. So then I notified SDCERS, and they spent a month or two looking into it, and then money started coming out. Then a month or two later, on March 13th, I met with SDCERS Legal, and I showed them the 73.85%.
Yeah.
I thought for sure that when I met with the retirement counselor the second time to re-sign on March 15th, I thought I would see all the calculations of this supposedly 64 calculation. There was nothing. That's part of my presentation, is that I believe the biggest mistake happened then, and I'm being punished and penalized for an internal SDCERS mistake.
Well, you're not being punished or penalized. The question is, in my mind, isn't whether you get 73.85%, because that was an estimate. I'm convinced from the documents that was an estimate. They didn't have the number yet. They didn't have the DRO yet. So they were going off an estimate. What I'm still not clear about, and it's my fault, I'm sorry for not knowing the rules well enough, but what I'm still not clear about is whether what Ms. Rossman is telling us is that by March, there was nothing you could do about the election date. It was set in stone. You were in drop, in essence.
Well, let me clarify. He signed the election paperwork in September.
Right.
He understood the calculation March 27th. That's when he got the calculation. So the question, I think, with this whole issue, this whole to-do, is either we let him go retroactive to September when he signed his election, or the board decides to let him do it on March 27th. It's not an issue of whether he's in drop or not. It's an issue of when he's in drop, and the timeline is either between September and March 27th. That's the whole issue we're talking about.
Is that right?
Do I understand that?
No, that's.
Well,
I'm in drop.
wait. With all due respect, you're not counsel. Go ahead. Go ahead, Johnny.
I think it depends. Mr. Wilson's framed different issues throughout his appeal. So if Mr. Wilson is saying today I still wouldn't enter drop because now I know the percentage, then the board has to decide whether or not he was
Let him out.
given inadequate information. The problem with the situation is that when a member enters drop, they should have their domestic relations order so they can have all the information they want. Mr. Wilson and his ex-spouse failed to do that. So in order to help the member, we will often recognize a drop entry date. But in doing so, we along with the members don't know what that percentage is. And Mr. Wilson in this case was adamant that he wanted to enter drop in September.
But we
So
could,
hence this issue.
but we couldn't we allow him to withdraw his drop entry retroactively if we wanted to? In light of the fact that he didn't have the information that he claims would have made a difference, if we conclude that, yeah, it should have made a difference to him, wouldn't we be able to say, okay, you're out?
Yeah, there's case law in extreme situations where a retirement system fails to inform their member adequately of their options, that the court has said you get a renege and have a mulligan. So that's something the board would have to decide based on the facts of each case.
That's really all I want to look at, and I'm not saying I'm predisposed one way or another on it. I'm just not sure I understand it well enough to make a decision.
I think.
But
for
Marcel's telling me the information's in the notebook. I just need to read it.
For staff's benefit, if Mr. Wilson could, I think for staff's benefit and the board's benefit, if Mr. Wilson could explain exactly what he wants. Does he want to enter drop now, based on whatever the correct DRO percentage is? If he wanted to enter drop whenever, I think that's part of the confusion of trying to educate Mr. Wilson on what that percentage is, because that changes depending on what he wants.
Can I add one more thing? I'm sorry. This is an inherent part of the process that you complete your drop paperwork, regardless of whether or not you have a DRO, in advance of when you're going to retire, and you get an estimate. And people quite often sign their drop paperwork 6 months in advance. And when they sign it 6 months in advance, it's then irrevocable after 7 days, regardless of what
Whether the estimate's right or wrong.
Right, and so we strive very much to give accurate, complete estimates. And in this case, my understanding is the benefit estimate was close. It's the percentage of the DRO that was different. So it's, again, as Johnny said, it's up to the board. Staff doesn't have authority to do anything different than what we did.
And then he would, if we did make that decision, then he would have 1 year of retirement contributions to catch up?
There's been drop contributions made, so it would be the difference between the two, yes.
I know, but I mean, it hasn't been his pension contributions, that has not been withdrawn from his check for a year.
Correct, just the drop contributions.
So would it be okay, I mean, would it be okay if we asked staff to come back to us at the next meeting with looking at this question of whether the board should exercise discretion to give a mulligan in this case because of special circumstances versus just but the special circumstances would be that by the time March rolled around, he still could have opted out? Because it sounds like the answer is no, he couldn't. No. He was in. So the email on October 4th was correct.
Yes.
You are in drop.
The challenge I'm having with this is that when people are going through divorce and they have these DB plans, you're negotiating the settlement with your spouse. The question becomes, what are we dividing? And these calculations aren't perfect. These are estimates. The 73%, theoretically what should have happened and may very well have happened is the lawyer goes, oh, total benefit 73%. We're negotiating what's community, what's separate, what are we doing with this issue? And so you're not going to get to an exact number. Rarely does anybody know what the exact number is until after the system has calculated that benefit. This stuff always happens, I shouldn't say always, generally happens after the fact. The question becomes, for whatever reason, Mr. Wilson's making a decision to enter drop. And he did it in September. That's what
Is the 10% differential? He's now getting 64 or 65 instead of 75, or 64 instead of 74. Is that differential extraordinary in your experience between an estimate and a final calculation?
And additionally, how does that arise? Does it only arise because of the change in the date?
The difference in the calculation?
Right.
The difference in this case, my understanding, is the difference in the calculation was because we didn't have the final DRO paperwork. So without the final paperwork telling us what to do, there can be differences. I do not know in this case what the exact circumstances were for why there was a difference between the initial calculation and the final. Generally, the initial calculation is done using a straight, it's called Brown formula, and I don't know if the DRO said something different than straight Brown formula. Cynthia may have the answer to that one.
Susan does.
Or Susan?
I believe that we didn't have the Brown formula in front of us. Obviously, as you said, we don't have the finalized DRO in September. The retirement counselor made an estimate. I'm unsure how he calculated that amount. We have checked, but we did make sure that he informed the member it was an estimate and it was purely an estimate.
I'm comfortable with the fact that it was an
Okay.
estimate.
So am I.
I want to know what part of that formula changed to create a 9% difference. I want to know the math of it.
Cynthia?
May I please try? Thank you. And I think I can address both of these. If I could just make just a couple of points. Staff discussed this extensively, and I met with all of my counselors in talking about how we handle such situations. People regularly come in who have a DRO. Obviously, about 50% of people are in this situation. Most people, when they come in and the counselor tells them that they do not have a completed DRO, and therefore we can't determine the final numbers, most people choose to wait to enter drop. They get the information at the appointment, they go, okay, they go back and work with their lawyers, they finalize the DRO, they come back in, they get a new, very good estimate, and then enter drop at that time. Occasionally, we had a case before us a few months back where the person they know they've got a DRO out there, they know it's gonna take part of their benefit, but they specifically wanna enter on their 55th birthday. It's important to them that they wanna enter drop to maximize that time period. In this case, the counselor provided an estimate, which was stated as an estimate, based on entering drop on that date. So Ms. Boone, that is what would change that calculation. That percentage would change every single day based on the service credit and all the numbers that go into that to creating the benefit. I think, don't let me put words in your mouth, but what I'm thinking that the member is wanting is the option to enter drop at a different time, which under the board rules, staff is not allowed to do. Trying not to talk like a lawyer and suggest that the board could adjust that date. There is nothing we can do to pick his percentage or to give him the 73%. It's what the DRO says and it's what the numbers will equal. I do believe that you have stated correctly that the issue is the timing of when he would enter drop. Some people would choose that they want to wait a further period of time, which would add service credit and money into the account, which would make the whole benefit higher, and then would make the DRO calculation different based on a percentage that has already been set.
But just so we're clear, whether he enters drop in March or September, we're not going to see a huge difference in that percentage. There's going to be movement clearly because the calculation is going to change, but we're not going to see it go, whatever it is, 80.
9%.
It's not going to be, well, but part of that's because the way the court ruled on the service credits that he'd purchased, and part of it's based on how it allocated between him and his wife. There was a whole bunch of issues. So those inputs are not going to change. The only thing that's going to change is the calculation based on whether it was September, January, March, whatever it is. And the movement is going to be, I'm going to guess, de minimis. But there's going to be some movement.
I wonder if I could just get back to one of my questions, which is this 9 or 10% differential unusual? I mean, are we dealing here with an outlier case, or is this normal? Estimates can be off by 10%.
Well, but the 9 or 10 is based on the calculation, based on how the court entered the DRO.
Well, but he's being put in drop as of the September date, so what difference should that make? In other words, he was in drop. On October 4th, he was in drop. It's dated back to September.
I do think I have the answer on the differential, your question about that. The issue here is that the numbers that were provided in the estimate were not from an official court document. Looking back now, I would suggest that that discussion should have never happened. The counselor should not have provided that estimate. They were trying to be helpful. They were trying to give an idea of how, with the information we have, this is what it looks like. We talk about this, but we have the balance of trying to be helpful and help people make a decision, and then we give information and it backfires. We were not joined by the courts in September when he came in. So if we had been joined, I would say that you would think that differential would be very small. That original number that was given in September, I believe, was much more of a guesstimate than a good estimate.
That's what I'm hearing between the lines is maybe the counselor not only didn't have the DRO, but didn't have the right formula in mind, or didn't have enough information to even do it.
And Val, just as a point of clarification, we were joined by, I think what Cynthia meant is that we didn't have the DRO in September.
I understand.
Thank you.
I guess the difference is, what I want to make sure I've understood about this 9% is that this 9% is not some crazy number. The difference is if the court had come down and said everything's divided 50-50, or whatever simple formula they used, it would have been no problem. The problem is the court allocated different things differently and came up with a mixture. It allocated the purchase service credits to her, because community property, it did a bunch of things which resulted in this 9%. Nothing to do with SDCERS.
No, I'm hearing just the opposite, that SDCERS counselor made an estimate with inadequate information.
But based on what, okay, well, maybe let me ask the question. Where was SDCERS counselor getting its information?
Based on information, preliminary information that had been provided by the member and
But that's
spouse.
and this is exactly my point. Okay, if you come to me and say I want an estimate, and I say, okay, well, wait, what do you want me to base it on? And the member says, well, here's what I think is going to happen, and the member is wrong because the court disagrees with him and comes back later and says this is the DRO. Yeah, that calculation is going to be off. It's not off 9% because our staff screwed something up. They took the information, the inputs they were given.
That's not what I'm hearing, Tanasi.
But that's what I'm hearing.
I'm hearing that our staff screwed up by giving the estimate based on inadequate information.
No, our staff, wait, I just want to make sure I'm correct about this. Our staff gave information, but gave an estimate based on information provided by the member.
That was not a finalized DRO.
I understand, but the information was provided by the member.
And I'm hearing that we routinely do this.
Yes. Correct? I mean, so, in other words, let me put it this way. Our counselor did not make up the numbers himself or herself.
Correct.
Okay, it was provided by the member. And the member happened to provide information that was different than what the court eventually ordered. So the estimate was correct based on what the member provided, and it was adjusted to the court order later.
I'm not sure you're just making those facts up. Can I ask Mr. Wilson his view on that?
Well, you can, but I wanted to just make sure I've understood from our staff's perspective first.
But you're putting words in our staff's mouth that aren't the words I'm hearing from our staff.
I think we're hearing it differently.
Yeah.
Let me ask the question. Cynthia, can you, I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth. I want to understand that. So can you help explain that? And then we can go back and ask Mr. Wilson.
If a member were to come in and say, I'm working on my DRO, and I believe my specs and I are going to split it 60-40, the counselor in that situation would go, okay, your full pension is this, and here's a 60-40 split. I don't think that's a good idea because that clearly left the member with an idea of, even though it was clearly stated it was an estimate, that gave the member the idea that that's how it's going to be.
I don't believe that's what happened in this case because I don't think the member and his spouse, at least I have not heard that the member and his spouse came in and said, we think we're going to split this 74.85% and whatever the difference between 100 and that number is. I think the counselor did a calculation. I think the counselor did an estimate. I don't think that's what happened here. Cynthia, would you comment back to me on what I'm saying?
The only way to know this is if we actually saw the calculation and what the basis of that calculation was and how that calculation came about.
Agreed.
And for me to answer your question accurately, I would need to go and look at the binder that is sitting right there, and I appreciate wanting to stick to the facts.
So the question we have is, what are we doing with this issue right now? And it seems to me that we have enough issues out there that we simply are going to should bring this issue back at the next meeting. Is there anybody who disagrees with that?
Thanasi, I would just ask that Mr. Wilson clarify, or that the board clarify what issue specifically is being brought back, because as was pointed out, he's changed his appeal throughout this. So to be prepared and to answer your questions, I want to make sure that I understand what is on the table.
Greg, go ahead. We've kept you silent long enough. Please say something.
And I appreciate staff's knowledge and expertise in addressing the questions. Again, in looking at staff's behaviors and actually administering this account, I believe that we've been following the rules and guidelines that are generally established for handling these types of issues. And it really comes down to the member disagreeing with that. So to me, it would make sense to return this matter back to the staff and specifically to the member and have the member clarify what are they appealing, what actions are they looking for, rather than us trying to guess what remedy they would like. I'd like to hear the member appeal where we made an error and what they would like to fix.
Okay. Well, I mean, I have no problem with a motion that basically, essentially continues this until the next meeting date, where Mr. Wilson, I would say that you need to sit down with staff and you guys need to figure out what it is that we're appealing, because I can tell you some of the things that at least that showed up on the memo just can't we can't do anything about. There are other things we may be able to do something about, and it would be helpful if we're all on the same page. So maybe the motion is to direct staff to go back, meet and confer with Mr. Wilson, and figure out what is it that we are going to deal with, and bring that back next time. What I'd like to just caution everybody on is, please don't ask us to do something other than what the DRO says. That I don't think is anything that we can do. So when you're in your discussions, don't ask me to change the percentage. Don't ask me to confirm a benefit that's different than what the DRO says. Drop when you enter. All those, whatever you guys want to discuss is fine with me. Okay, so that's just advice. That's not anything else. But I think what we need to do maybe is to move that we bring this issue back at the next meeting and instruct staff and the member to meet and confer about the issues that they want the board to address.
Could I make my proposal for what I think
Absolutely.
that we should be addressing? I think the appeal should be framed as whether the member should be permitted by the board in its discretion to select a later drop date or opt out of drop entirely due to the communications that occurred in September and or March between the member and staff. And if staff followed all the appropriate protocols and the member was not in any way disadvantaged or inadequately informed, then I think the answer is no. And if the member was not adequately informed or staff made any mistakes or errors or violated any of our protocols in the manner in which the estimate was prepared or done, then I think the answer may be yes. And then we're going to have to say to the member, okay, what is your election? So I think that's how we proceed. Unless somebody disagrees, I would ask staff to go back, and I do think it would be a good idea to meet and confer with the member, but ultimately I think it's a matter of staff's doing the investigation and reporting back to us what happened here, and are there circumstances that could possibly justify the board in exercising that discretion.
And if I could just add one more piece that may be slightly related or slightly unrelated, is if this is not an uncommon occurrence that this happens, I would entertain proposals from staff on whether this is a practice that we should be continuing more broadly as a policy question.
Do you want to craft a motion in particular? Because you started off with what sounded like a motion and then added some kind of.
No, I would simply table this motion pending a further report on whether there are facts or circumstances that would support the board exercising discretion to allow the member to choose a different drop date or opt out of drop. And if there are such facts, I'd like to hear about it. And if the staff concludes that there are not such facts, I'd like to hear about it. And then Mr. Wilson is likely to return and want to explain to the board if he believes there are such facts and the staff got it wrong.
I'd like to suggest that Mr. Wilson come away from those meetings with a complete and thorough understanding of how the percentage is calculated. It sounds like you have different alternatives you may want to explore, so I believe that staff can likely do those calculations for you. So I'd need you to come back with the agreement that you agree with the math calculation that staff is making. Whether in principle you agree with it or not is a different question, but that you agree with the math of it, and explore some of the alternatives that have been recommended.
Okay, so I'm going to recognize Val's motion to table this discussion until next meeting. Second to that motion?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, the ayes have it. We are tabling that motion until next meeting. Mr. Wilson, thank you. You have survived at least 2 more months on your appeal. All right. Thank you. What's that?
We're good.
All right. So item number 2, appointment of Gregory S. Pronounce that name for me. Koyeski to a second term as independent non-board member of the audit committee. I understand that he was an unsavory type individual, but nonetheless, we liked him enough that we should probably vote him in. Can I have a motion to approve his?
Oh, there's a little change there. Oh, yeah.
To approve his second term?
You want to change it?
Yes.
No,
No.
I'll withdraw my move.
No, no change.
No change. Go ahead. Can I get a second? All right, we ready to?
Ready to vote.
Fantastic.
All votes are in.
All right. And that motion passes unanimously 5-0. All right, item number 3, number of board members required to place an item on the meeting agenda. And I understand that it's one of the highlighted items. Who is going to be speaking? Oh, Johnny is. Did you, just out of curiosity, was it necessary for you to move from there to there?
Yes. Then I'll
Okay,
say-
good. That's definitely going to be better, I can tell.
Hey, at the last meeting, this committee asked staff to look into our practice or the board's policy of allowing just 2 board members to put an item on the agenda. So my staff report details what we found and also gives recommendations if desired. So in summary, any 2 trustees or any 2 board members can put an item on a board agenda, and in fairness, a committee agenda as well. What staff is recommending is we think 2 is fine. There's no real bright line rule about how many there should be, how many trustees it should take to put an item on the agenda, but 2 is fine. If the board, however, I do think that the policy should explain or clarify who can put an agenda item on the full board agenda versus a committee agenda. It doesn't make sense to me for an audit committee member to put something on the B&G committee agenda, for example. So before you, I've copied and pasted what I called option A and option B in my staff report on the screen so you can see it all together at one, and then you could vote if you'd like to. Option A simply separates who can include an item on the board agenda and keeps that number at 2. Option A then sets the committee agenda can be changed by 2 committee members. Option B is if you want to change that number, if you want to increase it, which was suggested at the last committee meeting, then that is suggested language for that. But by no means is staff advocating any change or even the numbers in option B.
And you're seeking the board to make a decision on either option A or B if they're so inclined.
Yes.
Okay. So from my perspective, I am really good with option A. I don't think that, I mean, we have a small board to begin with. If 2 people think something should be on the agenda, I think it should be on the agenda. So if there's, that would be my recommendation, is that we approve option A. Is there anybody who feels differently?
I have a slightly different
please.
perspective since
Absolutely.
I asked the question. So I want to first of all thank staff for researching the information. And my perspective is that we have a fairly collaborative board. The last item notwithstanding.
Except for that last item we had.
We tabled it unanimously. What was the problem?
If you don't have 2 lawyers, there'd be no business for lawyers. So.
And so I think the current board is not necessarily my concern, but I think in the future, being very mindful and respectful of minority members on the board in terms of numbers, I still think that you would want to have more than just 2 folks out of a 13-member board being able to put items on the agenda. I have seen some very interesting things happen in the past at different boards and councils and committees and et cetera, when a very small minority can put items on the agenda. And so my recommendation would be that it is stronger policy to respect fewer members, but a little bit more than 2. So I would prefer option B.
Anybody else have any comment?
And I would go with B also.
And as to how many members, though?
Right.
I mean, how many?
Option B states 4, so it would be 4, increasing it from 2 to 4.
And to clarify, almost it says 4 for an agenda item for the board, and then 1 less than a quorum for a committee.
To me, it seems appropriate. It's a strong minority as opposed to a very small minority.
So what you're talking about, just to put into perspective, is you're going to require 26% of the board just to put an item on the board for discussion.
That's correct.
Val, do you have any?
Yeah, when I first heard about this, I thought it was a solution in search of a problem. And I almost is basically saying, yeah, it is for this board under these circumstances. It's more of a policy question than a problem. And I don't have the board experience. I've been on boards most of my life, but usually one at a time, and usually boards that are collaborative. I haven't been on boards where there has been the kind of conflict that can maybe political agenda that Almas has seen in his experience. And so I am persuaded by him that I need to rethink my position on it. but I'm still, it seems like 4 board members is an awful lot of people to have to go buttonhole and round up in order to just get something on the agenda. And a lot of times in our discussions, as the discussion develops, people do change their minds. This is a pretty open-minded board without a lot of agendas. And so just having the discussion's been really useful a lot of times. So that concerns me about raising the minimum. But I'm about to go off this board. And I'm also concerned about, what if things change in the future? So I'm really torn on it.
This board hasn't always had this personality. This
Right.
has been an acrimonious board in years gone by, and boards do change.
Yeah.
Of course, there was a troublemaker.
I'm not sure that I agree with your issue that there had been acrimonious boards in the past. I think that the boards had issues with whether or not you could seat certain number of elected, non-elected officials. There's a bunch of other issues, but the board, interestingly enough, in most of those cases, acted unanimously, even in that time frame. But here's my issue: the worst thing that can possibly happen by putting something on a board agenda is that it gets discussed, and it either gets voted for or voted against, or it gets tabled or amended. There's some action that happens with it. So the one thing that I am concerned about by raising it to 4 members is that are we preventing something from getting to a board that should be discussed, needs to come out? Because the issue that you're concerned about it's a two-edged sword, right? If it's too low, then all kinds of nonsense gets on. If it's too high, then we can potentially exclude something that really needs to be addressed and needs a forum. So I don't know that I think your position has caused me to rethink things, but I'm not sure that I want to have 26% or 30% of the board just to put something on. Then the other issue from a practical perspective is, do I come close to violating the Brown Act by just trying to get 4 other people to join me on putting something on the board? I'm at some point, what numbers am I pushing? Because I've now talked to all of my board members to get 4.
If you talked serially to 8 board members hoping to get 4 to join you in putting this on an agenda, would you violate the Brown Act?
If you discuss it substantively, yes.
Which that's one of the interesting issues. How would I not discuss it substantively?
So you'd agendize it during a meeting, I guess. There's an opportunity to raise new issues during a board meeting that aren't agendized, and say, can we get this on the agenda for a future meeting? So you do it in open session, I guess.
You could. Okay.
If you have 2 board members with an agenda, you don't hear about it once. You hear about it at every meeting.
I think we need to do something about our amortization rates schedule.
All right. Well,
Can we split the difference?
does somebody want to make? Does somebody want to make a motion? I mean, if you want to split the difference, I don't have an issue with that. Do you want to make a motion to that effect?
I would make a motion for option B because there's already language up there, and I don't know that I want to wordsmith, from the dais up here.
Did you want to amend that to knock it down to 3?
I would be happy with 3.
Are you willing to amend your motion?
I'm amenable to that. That does bring up the question about the committee, for the committee, because the committee language indicates 1 less than a quorum.
Right.
Which could be 2.
Could be 2.
Yes.
So maybe that's fine then. So sure, let's do 3.
As revised. Noting that the revision is just for 3 trustees to add something to the board agenda.
Just part 1, yeah.
Yeah.
Part 2 of option B remains the same.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. We have a first by Almas. We have a second by Roberto.
Ready to vote.
All right.
All votes are in.
And that passes 5-0 unanimously. All right. Item number 4, staff's recommendation to revise the Chief Compliance Officer Charter and General Counsel Charter. And that was not one of the ones flagged for discussion. Is there anybody on the board that on the committee that thinks that we need to have some discussion about this, or are we ready to vote?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's put the buttons up. Moved by Roberta, seconded by Thomas.
Ready to vote?
All right. And
All votes are
that
in.
passes 5-0. Okay, item number 6, staff's recommendation to revise board rule 5.10.
Wait, we have
That's,
number 5, right?
oh, did I miss? I'm sorry, I missed 5. Staff's recommendation to revise the board policy regarding a disaster event, information technology, and a whole litany of other stuff. That was one of the items to be flagged for discussion, so Susan. And the good news, Susan, you have no opposition speaking against you, so fire away.
Perfect, thank you. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the substantive changes in here. The board policy regarding a disaster event, we are substantively changing that to list the successive leaders if the CEO is unavailable in a disaster event. The overpayment and underpayment of benefits policy, we're asking to add a procedure to address the underpayment of benefits, which will mirror the overpayment of benefits in essence within that policy. The underpayment and overpayment of contributions policy. Similarly, we're asking to add a procedure to address the overpayment of contributions within that policy. Public Records Act policy, we're requiring advance payment of copies if there's 20 or more pages by the requester. And the appeal of staff decisions regarding benefits policy, we're clarifying that the Business and Governance Committee can refer appeal to a hearing officer to resolve disputed facts and not questions of law. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Anybody on the committee have any questions? All right, do we have anybody, do we have a motion to approve the staff's recommendation? All right, so it's approved, it's been moved by Val, seconded by Thomas. Ready to vote?
Yep. All votes are in.
All right, that passes 5-0. Item number 6, staff's recommendation to revise board rule 5.1. This was not one of the ones flagged for discussion. So can I get a motion to approve the staff's recommendation? Approved by Val, seconded by Roberta.
Ready to vote?
That motion passes 5-0. Item number 7, staff's recommendation to revise board rules divisions 7, 8, and 10. That is flagged for discussion. Do you wish to sit where you are, or do you want to move to the big chair?
I'd like to sit here.
All right, you go right ahead.
Thank you, Thanasi. Staff just wanted to highlight 2 substantive but discretionary recommendations that affect how we do hearings at SDCERS. One is that staff would like to recommend to the board that they not allow a non-attorney to represent a member or an applicant at a hearing. Some systems do in different procedures, different situations, but because of the seriousness of these hearings and honestly sometimes the practice of law, staff is recommending against allowing that practice. The second is concern with releasing psychiatric documents to an applicant. Case law says that we should be careful about giving psychiatric documents to the patient because of the effects that the reading those documents can have. And so we are recommending that staff restrict giving those documents to the patient unless we have either a court order commanding us to do so or the physician psychiatrist allows us to do so. Any questions about that or anything else in the report?
Johnny, this was just passed, approved by the Disability Committee unanimously.
Thank you for reminding me. We had the Disability Committee look at this, and they didn't recommend any changes to what staff is recommending.
And since we know what those people are like, we should take a closer look at it here on this committee and make sure we want to pass it. No. Are there any other questions by the committee members?
Thanks.
Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve staff's recommendation? It's moved by Val, seconded by Thomas,
Ready to vote?
and that motion
Passes.
passes 5-0. All right, we are now at item number 8, adopt calendar year 2019 board and committee meeting schedule. And I'd like to move all the dates one to the left. No, I'm sorry. It's fine, sorry. It's okay. It's okay. It was better when I sat over there, wasn't it? I know. It's okay. All right, anybody have any questions? Do I have anybody who wants to make the motion?
It's already moved and seconded.
Oh, it's already moved and seconded. Let's vote.
All votes are in.
And that motion passes 5-0. All right, we have new business. Under new business, no action requested. We have 3 items. Is there anybody that wants to discuss any of them or wants to hear reports on any of those 3 items? None of them, by the way, were flagged in yellow as discussion points. Hearing none, let's go to the staff reports by division. I think we've got 2 of the 7 that we're going to hear from, Cynthia and Marcel. Who would like to go? I guess Cynthia's going to go first. Fantastic. Can you bring up the 3-minute button? No, just kidding.
Good morning. I would like to highlight the outreach to our stakeholders, which was mentioned in my staff report. Sincere engagement with our members matters because the more our members understand what we do, the better we can serve them. So we work very hard toward that. On just this past Tuesday, our executive team went and gave our annual presentation to the Retired Employees Association. It was very well received by the group. Next week, we will be meeting with the leaders of the retiree associations in a group that is called the Retiree Issues Task Force. This meeting will specifically include the city's risk management department, and we will be having a debrief on our healthcare open enrollment, which is a very important topic to the retirees. Last month, we had 2 excellent meetings with the police union leaders and the fire union president. Both of those organizations have had a major change in leadership over the past year, and it was excellent to reconnect because having a working relationship with them is very important. As you can imagine and as you've seen, members often go to their union or to a trusted colleague rather than to me when they have their first question, and so I want to bridge that gap and help everyone to understand how the process works and how they can access me. Received very positive feedback from those meetings.
Maybe we could put Tom's phone on call forward.
That is actually how it's arranged. It's been working well. Actually, yes.
It feels that way.
Yes. And I greatly appreciate it. I appreciate the position that board members are in and how we work together on a process that is appropriate and most helpful to members. And then coming up soon, we will be having our regular meetings with the Unified Port District and with the Airport Authority. We meet regularly with their leadership teams to engage on all issues that matter. And of course, we speak with everyone regularly, but having the face-to-face personal meetings really makes a difference. And so I wanted to just thank everyone for their efforts on that and very much appreciate our members and the plan sponsors and the stakeholder groups because everyone makes an extra effort to have this engagement, and I think it benefits everyone. And that's all I wanted to share today, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I'm going to excuse the increase in the call wait time in June based on the fact that there was a higher volume of calls.
Thank you, and I would like to report that for the last 6 weeks, the call wait time has been 11 seconds.
And actually, you guys, even on high call volume, had 17 seconds in July, which is rather impressive.
They were amazing, and I was very impressed because we also had 2 new supervisors there, as I had mentioned. Victoria Fedelizo and Andrea Valdez did an excellent job, absolutely stepping in and working with staff.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Marcel, do you want to sit there or do you want to go to the...
I'm not going to sit at the big girl table
All
this
right,
time.
just checking. Okay.
I will later.
Good.
So dovetail in what Cynthia was just discussing. One of the questions that had been asked of us was the utilization on Care Council. And in my report, I talk about almost 1,000 calls were answered. So you look at the call wait time in June, there could have been close to another 1,000 calls, which were handled by Care Council, which is fantastic. We're very happy about that. There seems to be a silver lining to the challenging open enrollment that we had this year. As you all know, we did change providers, and that did cause an increased workload. We had over 2,000 members that had to pick something else. We stressed very much to use Care Council, and the feedback I got from the REA meeting, as well as the feedback that we get from the actual surveys from Care Council, is that they were responsive, they were helpful. We had 85% of their survey respondents classified them as providing the highest level of service, and 88% of the phone calls to Care Council were resolved in the first phone call. I did have several people come up and talk to me, several retirees, after the REA meeting saying they'd never called Care Council before. They called them because they were confused or they needed questions answered. They were very helpful, and that would be their first phone call next time. So I'm hoping that those utilization rates continue to go up. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is we've had a goal of mentoring staff and providing leadership opportunities and looking at them taking more active roles in the community. And I'm happy to announce that Fong Nguyen on my staff is chairing the Benefits Roundtable at Calipers next Friday. They meet 4 times a year. It is invited, all of the systems in California are invited. There usually is a good number of people there and some robust discussions, and I'm very proud of him for stepping up to chair that event next Friday.
Excellent. Anybody have any questions? All right, so then I will ask of the rest of staff, 3 through 7, is there anybody who wishes to augment their report, make some correction to their report, educate us about something in their report? Don't jump at once, don't feel like you need to, but if you want to, it's available. Seeing no hands, is there anybody in the committee who wishes to grill staff on something that's in their report, perhaps maybe demean them a little bit from time to time? No, I'm just kidding. All right, Tom.
The last B&G meeting was run much more efficiently.
Thank you. I know.
And
Yeah, I know.
and we touched on every item.
Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah, but
that.
I didn't heckle you the way I did Tanasi.
It's just not a full day if I haven't been heckled by Val. I got to be honest with you. So, all right. Hearing none. Any questions and comments from anybody? Nope. Yep.
Could I raise one thing? I think we're going to get to this tomorrow in the full board meeting, but I want to make sure everyone knows that I've asked Greg to try and schedule another annual board retreat and to do it this fall rather than to wait until January or February. And in particular, what I'd like to ask the board to consider at a retreat on a Saturday morning is the policy for setting our discount rate. We set it, and we know why we set it, but we don't have an adopted policy for it, and that strikes me as rather a large gap in our sets of policies. And so I'd like to have our CEO and our actuary talk to us about that kind of policy, what the options are, the pros and cons of the different options, and find out whether the board is interested in adopting a policy. It'd be my wish to do it by the time of the March meeting, which would be my last meeting on the board, as well as Bill Hayner's. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But anyway, I wanted the board to know what I was up to there.
Do we have a date that you're thinking of for that?
I think we're looking at a couple of different dates. Optimal dates would be the 13th or the 20th. An alternative date could be the 27th of October. If we can't work it out for enough board members on those dates, we can keep going until we do. But
I'm not available on either the 13th or the 20th for whatever that matters. That means that you should schedule
let's
it on
try
those
and get it
days.
on one of those
That's
days.
Exactly. That would be a good date. I just want to give everybody fair warning right up front so that you guys can plan yourself out. But I am available on the 27th, so let's hope it doesn't go there, Val. All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Sure.
Thank you.